Now have House File 4, Representative Johnson, if you want to come before the, at the testifying table, please. You are far too good to
She's
us.
helping.
She laid it on pretty.
Okay, Representative Johnson moves House File 4, and just to see what we're looking at here, we have three folks listed to testify: Rand Lee, Ms. Nan Madden, Eric Bernstein. Is there anyone else that would wish to testify on this bill, so we kind of know where we're at? Okay, thank you. So Representative Johnson moves House File 4, be recommended to pass the committee and sent to the Ways and Means Committee. Please present your bill, sir.
Thank you, and I believe there is an amendment on that. Do we need to deal with that first?
Yes, we should. And this is to get the bill in the shape, where's the amendment? Oh, it's the 4A2 amendment. Okay, and this is just to get the bill, usually in tax committee, we let the author get the bill the way they want it, and then we can rip it to shreds after that. Okay, so I will, Representative Johnson moves the 4A2 amendment. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails. We now have the bill as amended in the shape the author would like. Please present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, and I just want to let you know, I have not broken tradition as far as bringing treats. Treats were brought and shared previously on this. And if you doubt it, there are Facebook pictures on it. And as we all know, if it happened on Facebook, it's real, right? But anyway, so I just want to bring this forward. One of the items, a top item when I was going door knocking was the issue of affordability. And we just touched on in the previous presentation here, we just talked about how unaffordable and how expensive it is out there. Members for people who are new parents, which I remember how expensive it was, and kind of Representative Herr kind of touched on it, the same reason that my wife decided, or we decided to have our kids breastfed, was for cost and for health. And so this is something that touches on that and affects on that. And one of the items, ways when I went door to door, was how do we help people keep in their homes, stay in their homes, help afford their home, food, and everything like that. And what this does is this House file brings forward to us a constitutional amendment to be put on the bill, out to voters to return the surplus, if there is a surplus of over 105% of the projected forthcoming year. And so this will bring it back, as I think it was roughly around 4 years the surplus was sitting out there, and people were wondering, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? How is it going to be spent? What this will do is, in the future, if there is surpluses going forward, this will put it back, if approved, send it back to homeowners, whether it is, or taxpayers, whether it's in form of property tax relief or income tax relief. And so that was what this does. 1 second, I just have to get to my sheet here. So excess tax collections would be determined based on comparison of forecast revenues to forecast expenditures for the fiscal biennium corresponding to legislative biennium. Projected revenues that exceed 105% of projected expenditures would then be transferred to this new account. The legislature would be able to choose which of two most recent forecasts to use for purposes of the revenue expenditure comparison. The legislature would be required to appropriate money in the tax relief account, which biennium for property or income tax refunds, or to offset the cost of one-time tax reductions. Refunds and tax reductions would be limited to taxpayers' liability for tax. So basically what this does is, instead of creating new ways to spend surpluses, this would actually put it back to the people who created the surplus. and this would help in situations like we heard earlier that would benefit greatly to Minnesotans. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Let's go to witnesses so we get them, and then, of course, we'll have member questions of the testifiers and of the author. So we have Rayanne Lee, Legislative and Coalitions Director, Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the committee again.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, for having me. For the record, my name is Rayanne Lee. I'm the Legislative and Coalitions Director for the Americans for Prosperity chapter here in Minnesota. We are the nation's premier grassroots organization. We are a community of millions of concerned citizens advocating for solutions based on proven principles. We thank you very much for the opportunity to testify in support of House File 4. I did also submit a letter along with an attachment that details our position a little bit more. We applaud the proposal to return surplus funds to taxpayers. We believe that Minnesotans, not government officials, are the best stewards of their money. As many of you know, grassroots is our game, and the Minnesotans that we have spoken to at the doors have told us that they feel like their wallets are growing thinner while the government has grown faster than ever. And quite frankly, a lot of them feel like they are not getting the bang for their buck. And, you know, some of them have even said, you know, I am not an unlimited ATM, and these price increases, these costs are hurting. So I think that at its core, House File 4 opens up the dialogue to discuss Minnesota's notoriously high tax rates. As we have seen over the years, we are overtaxed, and we've actually seen surpluses that are more than double the amount of the entire budget of the state of Nebraska. And while we are supportive of this money going back into the pockets of Minnesotans, we would challenge you to think outside the box and say, what if they never had to lose that money in the first place? So we would propose considering a trigger so that when there are revenue surpluses, there are rate reductions that go into effect, or even bracket consolidations. Furthermore, we also do recommend an overhaul of the way the state budgets. At its core, we really would like to focus on removing the volatility. So for example, using a 5-year look back that doesn't put us on an annual balance. And it really puts the state on a more reliable track so we don't have the volatility. A few other high-level points. We would propose limiting spending to trend revenue growth along with Minnesota's economic performance.
Ms. Lee, if we could testify to the bill before us.
Thank you.
Kind of going far afield here.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, we are just proposing some challenges. You know, we understand that this is a complex matter with many ideas and solutions. And I think the core, you know, is there are better ways to budget. So we are very grateful that you are hearing this bill. I never thought I would hear the word fun and taxes in the same sentence, but here I am today with you fine people. So we very much appreciate it. Responsible budgeting is important to everybody, no matter their political views. And so we thank you for your work.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Any questions for Ms. Lee? Okay, our next testifier is our friend Nan Madden. If you could please join. Thank you, Ms. Lee, for your testimony. Nan Madden, Minnesota Budget Project Director, Minnesota Council of Nonprofits. If you could please provide your testimony.
Thank you, excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Nan Madden. I am Director of the Minnesota Budget Project. The mission of the Minnesota Budget Project is to identify and advance public policies to make Minnesota a place where everyone can thrive, regardless of who they are or where they live. And I thank you for the opportunity to share our deep concerns with House File 4. We have a longstanding position that budget and tax decisions should not be made in the Constitution. That position is informed by the experience of going through a decade of frequent budget deficits in the 2000s, and the harm that has been done in other states that have such limits. I've provided the committee with a handout specifically about the damage done by the Tabor limit in Colorado, and another more generally about negative effects of such limits. The legislature already has this authority to use projected budget deficits for tax rebates or tax cuts, and our current system allows that to be done in a public debate that weighs the alternatives and implications of those decisions. This constitutional amendment takes away the ability of Minnesotans to influence the tax and budget decisions that impact their lives. It instead turns those important decisions over to an arbitrary formula. This limit would also undermine accountability. It circumvents meaningful public debate, and it makes it more difficult for the public to hold elected officials accountable for the impact of their decision. Constitutional revenue limits prevent public investments from keeping pace with growth in the economy or changes in our population. So the ability to fund schools, train our workforce, invest in Minnesotans' health and well-being, and maintain other services would be diminished over time. And as we have seen at other times when state revenues were constrained, Minnesotans want these services funded. So the responsibility pushed to local governments creates pressure on local property taxes, increases tuition at public colleges and universities, and other kinds of workarounds because the public do want to see these services funded. Constitutional limits also restrict the state's ability to respond to a crisis, to rebuild when coming out of a recession, or to respond to a substantial change in circumstances. This proposal would not just slow growth in the size of the state's general fund compared to what it is today. In a recession or other tough times, revenues drop, and policymakers have to make tough decisions to balance the budget. This amendment essentially locks in the impact of the recession and makes it more difficult to recover. This amendment could also make it harder to invest in roads, water treatment, and other infrastructure because it could raise the cost of borrowing. Bond rating agencies want to see that states have flexibility to respond to changing situations, but that flexibility is constrained by such amendments. In short, this proposal does not give you more tools to respond to the needs of Minnesota residents. It instead ties your hand. Thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Madden? Thank you very much for your testimony. We will now go to Eric Bernstein, Coalition Director, We Make Minnesota. And welcome to the committee, sir.
Chair Davids, members of the committee, for the record, my name is Eric Bernstein. I'm the Coalition Director of We Make Minnesota. We are a coalition of labor and grassroots organizations united in support of public investment for a more just and equitable state. We believe that public goods and services from education and healthcare to roads, parks, and libraries are the foundation that a strong economy and a prosperous society are built on. We advocate for the policies that support the state's long-term budgetary strength and stability. Thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective on HF 4, which proposes a constitutional amendment to create an automatic tax cut in the instance of a projected budget surplus. Our members oppose this bill because it will weaken the state's ability to fund essential social and physical infrastructure, and it will take decision-making power out of the hands of democratically elected lawmakers. The effect of this policy would be to exert a downwards ratchet on state funding, which would deplete state resources, weaken our infrastructure, and rob the public of important investment opportunities. The state already can and has often used budget surpluses to issue one-time rebates or permanent tax cuts. But leveling such cuts at a fixed rate and putting them on autopilot will only limit the legislature's ability to respond to contemporary context and pressing social priorities. It also ignores the necessary relationship between economic growth and public spending. Surpluses result most often from a strong economy, which both benefits from and depends on commensurate public investment. This is how we ensure public services keep up with technology and public sector wages keep reasonable pace with those in the private sector. Otherwise, we would live in a 21st century with 21st century wealth, but 19th century classrooms and libraries. This policy erases the possibility of collective prosperity that should be the goal of all societies, and that has long been a calling card of Minnesota specifically. In closing, I'd like to address the foundational premise of this policy, which is that less public spending is always preferable. Our coalition, which includes public teachers, healthcare workers, and local government employees in every county of the state, find that disposition highly objectionable. Our members in schools and hospitals and correctional facilities, they work extremely hard to keep this state running. They don't always oppose tax cuts or support tax increases as much as I might like them to, but the notion of a permanent blanket policy is hostile to anyone who provides or depends on public services, and that's all of us. So we urge you to vote no on this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your testimony. You want to stick around just a second in case we've got questions. Questions for the testifier? I guess you're way ahead of me. Thank you, sir. Thanks a lot. Before we go into member questions, I just want to announce what the agenda looks like for tomorrow. And some of you may have seen it, but we have a Rapinski bill up on Social Security subtraction, Representative Weiner, and the Browerville bill. Representative Harder has a Watertown. I think we might have Representative Smith kind of take the lead on this, their sales tax exemption. Sales tax, that one is. And then, of course, a fine piece of legislation that how many times we've passed this out here? The appurtenances, the taxation of attachments and appurtenances. So, Representative Norris, you had that? Somebody had that. No,
Representative Brand.
Brand had, okay, that's right. Representative Freiberg.
This wasn't to the agenda for tomorrow. Are we at member questions at this point?
Not yet.
Okay.
We will get there very quickly, I think. Chair Gomez.
Just wanted to say that we're not going to take it to the Supreme Court or anything, but the DFL tax team's position on treats that were delivered between January 14th and January 24th are that I believe the term is moot, Representative Stevenson. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Johnson, she's got a good point here. He really does.
Those were unconstitutional treats. Unconstitutional treats.
Good stuff. Well, we'll have to negotiate that. Well, and then also two other things before we get into member questions. Give me some DFL bills. We'll be looking for them. We want some DFL bills in here because it looks like I'm so partisan, and I'm really not. So
we have a fifth tier income tax.
well, like I said, the next week, we've invited Commissioner Marquardt. He's going to make an agency presentation first, and then he's going to present the governor's budget, and I've offered him as much time as he needs to do that, because we want to hear about the agency, we want to hear about the governor's budget proposals. So that would be into the next week. And then we'll get you tomorrow what we're looking at for Thursday. So that being said, let's go to member questions. Representative Freiberg.
Thank you to the bill author. So thank you for bringing this bill forward. I know the motion was to refer the bill to Ways and Means. Are there any other, I'll have a follow-up, and then just wondering if there are any other committee stops planned.
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then also to respond to the question regarding the representative brought up, I would be afraid that my response would give the impression I'm trying to influence votes if I said that. So,
Whatever it takes, man. I mean,
so.
okay, Representative Johnson.
So, thank you. So as far as going on to Ways and Means, I believe that is the only direction it was going to go after here. Is that?
I believe that's correct. Representative Freiberg.
Thank you. I was wondering because House Rule 4.15 says that bills proposing constitutional amendments have to be referred to the Committee on Rules before they receive their second reading. And then also, I know bills proposing, sometimes the Secretary of State's office has determined that there's a cost of, I remember this, I think from maybe the ERA discussion, but there is a cost of about $5,000 that is often borne by the Secretary of State's office. So, and actually, I'm not sure at this point whether that's in the jurisdiction of the Elections Committee or the State and Local Government Committee, but I feel like there might, referral to one of those committees might be in order also.
Very good point. I'm not sure right now if we should go to Ways and Means then to Rules, but Ways and Means is usually the last, no, Rules. If we go to Ways and Means, you can still go to Rules. No, other way? Who's our, what we have is a genuine conundrum, a quandary, if you will, a real-life dilemma. I mean, I want to do this right, and there must be anybody in research that might have a thought on that? Because Representative Freiberg brings up a good point. Do we need to go? No, you go to Ways and Means then Rules, right?
Well, the rule, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's see what
the
the
rule.
rule says.
The rule just says before it receives its second reading, it's silent as to the order that happens in. Whether there's a standard practice of the House is not something I know offhand.
Maybe if you send it to elections.
Representative Anderson?
Yeah, If you send it to elections, it'll have that time, and you could put a little tiny fiscal note on it.
Mr. Chair.
Representative Gomez.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I just have been in touch with our LD, with our legislative director. He says that rules is traditionally, to Representative Freiberg's point, the last stop for constitutional amendments before they hit the floor. So maybe a referral out of ways, if it needs to go to ways, 2 rules would satisfy that requirement, but.
Representative Freiberg, thoughts?
That's fine with me. Then I know there is also this issue of there is sometimes a cost to constitutional amendments for putting it on the ballot. I just don't know if that's.
And wouldn't that be covered in Ways and Means, Representative Freiberg? The cost? Do we have a fiscal note? Ms. Templin, save us here, please. I'm drowning.
Mr. Chairs, a fiscal note has been requested for House File 4 with the 2A amendment, and it is in process right now. The preliminary fiscal note was only completed by the Secretary of State, and that estimate did not show any cost. But it's preliminary.
Okay, was this in our packet? Members, if you could look in your packet, it does say 0 cost. Oh, that's the revenue, yeah. Mr. Clayman?
Mr. Chair and members, just to confirm the comments from Representative Freiberg and Representative Gomez, a referral to rules after Ways and Means would fulfill the requirements of Rule 4.15.
Thank you. Thank you for that information, sir. But very good point, very good point. So let's go that route. Let's see, we had Representative Smith and then Stevenson. Representative Smith?
Thank you, Chair. Representative Johnson, welcome to Tax Committee. So I think, just generally, I'll be honest, I think this is bad policy, but I have just some clarifying questions because I cannot get my head around how this would actually work. So bear with me a little bit as I ask you some questions. The first one, it was noted in the revenue estimate. In 1.11 of the bill, you use the phrase "to the property and income taxpayers of this state." Could you clarify definitionally what you mean by that? Is it people with liability? Is it, I'll just leave that question open-ended. How do you define that term that isn't defined in the bill?
You could have House Research take that one, so we get the definition here, unless Representative Johnson wants to take it, or
I would love to hear from the experts first before
Mr.
I guess
Clayman?
I'd have to clarify more anyway, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Clayman?
Mr. Chair and members, so yeah, income and property taxpayers would be any person subject to or any person that has a liability, a tax liability under the income tax. For property taxpayers, there may be somewhat of a gray area, but under the property tax chapters, the property taxpayer is typically considered to be the owner of the property. So it would be property owners who have a property tax liability and income taxpayers who have an income tax liability.
Representative Smith?
That's helpful. And a follow-up on that same line of questioning, obviously we have commercial and industrial tax levies that we do at the state level. Would they be eligible for any sort of refund through this program, since technically they're property taxpayers, corporations that own?
Mr. Clayman?
Mr. Chair and members, yes, I think that's the case, because if as long as they're a property owner and they have a property tax liability, the legislature could appropriate money for refunds, for instance, for those property owners who have that liability.
Representative Smith?
Okay, so large corporations will be able to benefit if they own land in Minnesota from this? Okay, I just wanted to be clear. Second question, when is the actual money going from the general fund to this new fund that you are creating? Because there's a lot of projecteds in the language. Is it immediately when the budget forecast is given? Is it that day the money is taken? Is it based off of the actual revenues we have and the projected expenditures, or is it off of both projections?
Ms. Templin? Or Mr. Clayman?
Mr. Chair, members, so likely what would happen is that the funds that, if there are any funds that meet the requirements to be transferred into the account, that would happen presumably, as soon as practical. And likely what would happen is that there would be a certain amount of those funds that would just be set aside in the general fund, so they wouldn't be available for the legislature to appropriate for any purpose other than the constitutionally prescribed purposes.
Representative Smith.
Thank you, Chair. And this is a question for the bill author, if you could. So 1.15 or 1.15, 1.16, 1.17, it says, in the account, the amount of projected revenues in the general fund that exceeds 105% of projected expenditures as determined, and then it goes on. And then if we turn the page to the actual question that is before the people of Minnesota, 2.1 through 2.3, you drop one of those projecteds. It says, funded by the amount of projected revenues that exceed 105% of just expenditures. Why is there no projected expenditures on the actual question before the people when the mechanism in the law is to do just that?
Representative Johnson.
One moment, I'd like to read this. I left my glasses back at my desk, sorry. So let me see. Could, Mr. Chair, Representative, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Representative Smith.
Yeah, sorry about that. I did go fast. So on that first page, 1.15 through 1.17, the verbiage or the actual text is deposited in the account of projected revenues in the general fund that exceeds 105% of projected expenditures. So there's two projected there, both the revenue side and the expenditure side, I assume from either the February or November forecasts. And then, but the actual question that is determined here on the second page, 2.1 through 2.3, it says the Minnesota tax relief account funded by the amount of projected revenues that exceeds 105% of expenditures. It leaves out that second projected. Why is that worded in that way?
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative. I'm just looking here because we also had that amendment that came in. I'm just looking to see if that made any adjustments to that, because I know, and I could be wrong, that we added also that it could be either forecast, I believe, also for either November or February that was included there. I don't have an answer for you. That's something, thank you for bringing that up. That's probably an amendment or something that we can make a change to.
Any thoughts, Mr. Clayman, on the Smith question?
Mr. Chair and Representative Smith, that may just be a technical error in the bill on line 2.2.
2.2. Representative Smith.
Can I offer a verbal amendment? I think it's important that if this is going to go forward, which it seems like it will, the people know that the expenditures are not done yet. This is also part of a projection, which I think is part of the problem with the policy, to be quite honest. So I would move to amend line 2.2 just to include projected in front of revenues. Or expenditures, excuse me.
Thoughts from the author?
I would agree that that word would make sense to be in there, yes.
Okay, Representative Smith moves that on line 2.2, after 105% of, we insert the word projected before expenditures. Any questions? Is that it, Mr. Representative?
Yeah, I think
Okay. Any questions on that? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion prevails. Thank you, Representative Smith. Any further questions?
I have some more sort of policy questions, but those are my clarifying questions, so I'll go lower on the list.
Okay. Representative Stevenson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I am wondering, I think a lot of us probably remember what it was like to be in the legislature in 2020, where I have a strong memory of being in this building and having a conversation with some folks in the afternoon one March day about how, I guess we're not shaking hands anymore. And then later that day, I got an email from the speaker saying, don't come to work on Monday. And we were gone due to the pandemic for a long time. And that was a huge event shaping the state's budget that came out after the February forecast and had massive implications for the forecast. So, my question for the bill author is, what happens when you have those exogenous events. To give one example that maybe would be to focus the conversation, we have right now a very active federal executive branch that's making a number of decisions that I think will have direct bearing on the state's budget and making them kind of in real time, including putting tariffs potentially that, will increase inflation, decrease GDP, thus affecting state revenues. But the most, I think, direct example was we had a memo issued by the Office of Management and Budget freezing federal funding. Thankfully, two federal courts found it unconstitutional the following day and freezed it. But, Minnesota gets, as I'm sure members know, about $2 billion a month from the federal government. And if that had happened, let's say that happened, February forecast this year comes out on March 6th. If that had happened on March 7th instead of in January, and this was in effect, what then? What happens? Is the legislature able to do anything in response to something that happens after the February forecast, or are we just stuck?
Representative Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. So basically, what we're working on is the what-if scenario, right? And what if something happens? So are you actually asked, where would the money come from if all of a sudden it wasn't there? Would it come from what has already been set up? And I apologize if I'm not as legislatively astute as you are and been around for as long as you have. But the money was there also for previous, don't we have a $3 billion set aside? That was set aside from part of the surplus, and I could be wrong. I'm getting caught a little bit on this. But if something happened, would that money have been there anyway? We spent the surplus, correct? We created enough programs to spend the surplus, so it's not there anyway. So then, basically, if we have a crisis, we'd have to deal with that crisis that came up, because what happened to the $18 billion surplus, along with the $10 billion in extra taxes? The $18 billion was spent. Is that there now, that we could go back and access it if we run into the situation that you're describing with the current situation with the federal fund coming in? Can we go back and get it? How is that different? And if I'm wrong and I'm not understanding it correctly, please help me understand where you're going with that question.
Representative Stevenson.
Mr. Chair and Representative, of course, the budget decisions that were made in 2023 are within the legislature's purview to revise and adapt as situations change, and I imagine that we will revise and adapt decisions we made in the past. The difference here is you're writing into the Constitution that the legislature can't touch this money. You're setting aside some money that we would have no control over. And in fact, one of the concerns that I have, I'm glad you bring up the budget reserve, because I'm kind of wondering about the interplay between this and the budget reserve. The budget reserve, you mentioned $3 billion, and that's where we are now. And we're there in part because one of the policies we have is that when the November forecast out, if it shows a surplus, a portion of it is diverted into the budgetary reserve. And I'm a little unclear because it's also unclear which forecast we're going to be talking about, November or February. I guess the legislature gets to pick. But if it were the November forecast, what's the order of operations here? Do we take the money first from put it into the budget reserve? Or do we first do this and then do the budget reserve? Those things are the interplay that I don't understand from this. But to get back to my question, which I think is a really important one, and I'm not sure that I've heard an answer yet, the legislature has a lot of authority to change appropriations and change programming in response to events. But you're taking some money here and freezing it. So what happens if after the February forecast, we have a crisis, whether it's a pandemic or a federal government that's freezing funding or something totally different that we haven't thought of? What happens then?
Representative Johnson.
Okay. Mr. Chair, thank you for the Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you for the question. So the question I have here back, I guess, is what do you do now? So if you put the money off and you give the money back to the people, it didn't exist. Right now, the budget is set up to basically be balanced, correct? So if we do have a crisis in a situation that comes up, we have to deal with it at that point. How is that much different than if the money was not there to begin with?
Representative Stevenson?
Well, Mr. Chair, Representative, and I don't mean to be repeating myself, the difference is that right now, we have the full state budget at our disposal. All of the revenue that's generated by the state, we have access to and the ability to use however we want. You know, I think projected revenues in the next biennium are north of $66 billion, and we have all of it at our disposal. This amendment would take some of that money, potentially a significant amount, and put it off limits. Can't be used for any purpose other than payments to taxpayers. That's the difference. And that's why I'm still not clear. I'm still not hearing an answer to what we would do. I think maybe the answer is, doesn't matter, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not having the ability to respond to those exigent events with the degree of flexibility that we have now. But that's the question is, what are you going to do if President Trump freezes federal funding on March 7th and Minnesota suddenly is facing a $2 billion a month shortfall, you know, and we have the inability to make our Medicaid payments, which we are required by law to make, by the way. We don't have any flexibility on providing those services to people. And we, if this passed, you take a big tool out of our toolbox. I can leave it there, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, I've got this room reserved tonight from 6 to midnight, but I'm not going to use it. Scared myself there for a second. So with that, members, I've got a list. It looks like the Greg Davis Fan Club. It's just really long here and distinguished. Great questions. This bill is not ready to go out of tax committee. We'll be rescheduling it. I don't know what date, so just look at your agendas to see it. And I have a great list of folks here with questions, so hold those thoughts. I'm sure you will. And so with that, we're going to lay this bill. It's still in the tax committee. We're going to lay this bill over at this point. It'll be brought back at the discretion of the chairs, some of us here.